The news broke like a thunderclap. Across every screen the headline flashed, "Just in, Letitia James forced to resign after Supreme Court drops nightmare news." It was the kind of story that made people stop mid-sentence, scroll slower, and lean closer to their phones. In a matter of minutes, social media was buzzing. Cable channels went live, and talk radio hosts were already choosing sides. But beyond the noise, in a small Brooklyn cafe filled with the smell of roasted coffee beans and rainy November air, two friends sat frozen trying to make sense of it all. Ava, a civil rights attorney known for her calm logic, watched the screen in silence. The anchor spoke quickly, summarizing a Supreme Court decision that had just shaken the legal world. The ruling limited the powers of state attorneys when handling politically sensitive cases. The decision didn't name anyone directly, but the fallout was clear. New York's Attorney General, Letitia James, had announced her resignation within the hour. Ava's friend, Marcus, a small business owner who spent his days juggling clients, deadlines, and rent, broke the silence first. "Forced to resign," he said, shaking his head. "That's wild. One ruling and it's all over." Ava sighed, pushing her coffee aside. "It's not that simple," she said. "This isn't about one person. It's about how far the law should let people in power go when they believe they're fighting for justice." Marcus scoffed. "Justice? Come on. Every politician says they're fighting for justice. Then they use the law to push their own side." He looked at her with tired eyes. "People like me? We just get caught in the middle." The cafe around them hummed with quiet energy. Conversations were starting at every table. People debating, arguing, trying to sound like experts. The barista turned up the TV volume, and the reporter's voice filled the room. She spoke of historic implications and constitutional balance. For most, it sounded like background noise. For Ava, it sounded like a turning point. She leaned forward. "Think about it," she said. "If every public official plays it safe, afraid to take action because it might look political, then nothing changes. No reform, no accountability, just silence." Marcus folded his arms. "And if they go too far? If they decide who's guilty before the courts do? That's not justice either. That's power without limits." Ava opened her mouth to reply, but stopped. He wasn't wrong. That was the thing about debates like this. Everyone had a point, and no one had all the answers. Outside, the rain turned heavier, blurring the city lights. The TV anchor continued, explaining how the court's decision emphasized fairness and restraint, warning against any use of public office for moral or political crusades. Legal experts were already calling it one of the most important rulings of the decade. Ava rubbed her forehead. "I get the principle," she said softly, "but justice isn't math. It's human. It's messy. Sometimes you have to take risks to do what's right." Marcus laughed quietly. "Risks are fine until you're the one paying the price. You ever been audited for no reason? You ever had an inspector show up the week after you spoke out against something? That's not balance, that's payback." She looked at him, realizing this wasn't just theory for him. He'd lived it. The cafe door swung open, letting in a burst of cold air and a group of college students. They were talking loudly, half joking, half serious. "Yo, she really resigned?" one said. "That's crazy. I thought she was untouchable." Another replied, "No one's untouchable anymore. Not when the court steps in." Their conversation faded into the hum of the room, but their words lingered. Ava turned back to Marcus. "Maybe that's the problem," she said. "We've started to think of every leader as either a hero or a villain. There's no middle ground anymore." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, and no trust either. Everyone's just waiting for the next scandal, the next headline. You can't run a country like that." On the TV, the screen showed the courthouse steps, cameras flashing as reporters surrounded officials and aides. There were no angry mobs, no dramatic speeches, just a calm resignation letter read aloud, ending with the phrase, "To preserve public confidence in the integrity of our justice system." Ava watched in silence. She could almost feel the weight in that sentence. Resigning to protect trust. It sounded noble, but also tragic, because trust was already in short supply. Marcus leaned closer, his tone softer now. "You think this will change anything?" Ava thought for a long moment. "Maybe not right away," she said finally. "But it forces people to talk, to think about what justice really means." "That's something," he smiled faintly. "Talking's easy. Doing the right thing, that's the hard part." The cafe grew quieter as the rain eased. The headlines still glowed across the screen, bold and dramatic. But its shock was beginning to fade. What replaced it was something quieter, reflection, doubt, and the uneasy awareness that power and principle rarely fit neatly together. Ava's phone buzzed with notifications. Legal forums, colleagues, and journalists were all debating the same thing. Was this ruling a safeguard for fairness, or a blow to moral courage? She didn't answer any messages. Instead, she stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker on the wet pavement. In that moment, it struck her. This wasn't really about Letitia James, or the court, or politics at all. It was about something much larger, the endless struggle between rules and ideals, between what's fair and what feels right. Marcus gathered his coat. "You coming?" he asked. "In a bit," Ava replied. "I just want to hear what they say next." He nodded and left, the bell over the cafe door jingling softly behind him. On the TV, the news anchor had moved on to the next segment. Reactions from both sides, calls for reform, predictions of what might happen next. But to Ava, it all blended together into one quiet truth. Every society walks a thin line between justice and power, and every time the balance shifts, someone pays the price. She took a sip of her now cold coffee, her thoughts spinning. Tomorrow, the debates would grow louder, and the headlines would change. But tonight, in that small Brooklyn cafe, she felt the full weight of the question that would linger long after the story faded from the screens. How much power should one person have to decide what's right for everyone else? And with that, the first chapter of the nation's newest debate began. Not in the halls of power, but in ordinary places, among ordinary people, trying to make sense of justice in an imperfect world. That night, the city was still buzzing from the news. Talk shows, podcasts, and live streams couldn't stop discussing it. The Supreme Court's decision that had forced Letitia James to resign was being called everything from a victory for fairness to a disaster for justice. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some shouted, others sighed. But in one small apartment in Queens, 3 friends were trying to understand what it all really meant. Not as politicians or pundits, but as ordinary people living through extraordinary times. Ava sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, legal documents spread out in front of her. She had spent the whole day answering calls from colleagues who were torn, some furious, some relieved. Now she just wanted to talk like a person again, not a lawyer. She started a group video call with Marcus and their friend Elena, who taught political science at a nearby university. Elena answered first, her background filled with books and soft yellow light. "I read the full court opinion," she said, skipping the small talk. "It's big. They didn't just rule against one case. They set a new boundary. Basically, the court's saying state attorneys can't use their office to go after people if it looks politically motivated, no matter how right they think they are." Marcus frowned. "So they're saying justice shouldn't depend on emotion?" "Not exactly," Elena replied. "They're saying it shouldn't depend on personal conviction. That the law has to stay neutral." Ava rubbed her temples. "Neutral," she repeated. "That word sounds fair, but it's complicated. What if staying neutral means letting powerful people get away with things? What if neutrality becomes another form of silence?" Elena leaned forward. "I get that, but where's the line? If one official decides they know what's morally right and acts without restraint, what stops the next one from doing the same, in the opposite direction?" Marcus jumped in frustrated. "That's what I've been saying! Every time someone uses their moral duty as an excuse, regular people like me get caught up in it. Taxes go up, regulations pile on, investigations start. Everyone's fighting for a cause, and no one's thinking about who gets hurt in the process." Ava shook her head. "But without people taking moral stands, nothing ever changes. Civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, all of that came from people who broke rules because they believed justice was worth the risk." Marcus wasn't convinced. "That's history, Ava. Back then, people fought against clear wrongs. Now everyone thinks their opinion is a moral crusade. It's not justice anymore, it's politics in disguise." The tension on the call grew. Elena tried to keep things balanced, her voice steady. "You're both right in a way," she said. "The court's decision is trying to stop abuse of power, but it also limits courage. The law can't be emotional. It has to be consistent. The question is, can consistency and compassion ever exist together?" For a few moments, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator behind Ava. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "You know what it reminds me of? My dad's old saying, you can't fix a crooked system by bending the rules." That's what always stuck with me. Because once you bend them, someone else bends them more. Ava looked down at her notes. "But sometimes the rules are the problem," she said softly. "Sometimes they protect the wrong people." Elena leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. "That's why this debate will never end. Every generation has to decide how much power they want to give to those who enforce the law. Too much, and it becomes tyranny. Too little, and it becomes chaos." Marcus laughed without humor. "So what you're saying is, no one wins?" "Not exactly," Elena said. "It's not about winning. It's about balance. The court's ruling is just one swing of the pendulum. History always swings back. Ava looked up, meeting their eyes through the screen. Do you think she knew this would happen? That stepping down might be the only way to stop the argument from getting worse. Elena nodded slowly. Maybe. Sometimes resignation isn't defeat. It's strategy. It resets the conversation. It reminds people that no one, no matter how powerful, is bigger than the system. Marcus sighed. Yeah, but what kind of system forces people out for trying to do their job? Elena smiled faintly, the kind that's trying to protect itself. They all laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Outside, the city was quiet. The excitement of the morning had turned into late-night reflection. The air felt heavy, as if everyone was collectively wondering where the line between justice and ambition really was. Ava sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. You know what scares me? She said. That people will stop caring. That this will just be another story they scroll past. If we stop arguing about justice, we lose the point of it. Marcus nodded. Maybe. But sometimes I think people argue too much and listen too little. Everyone's trying to win the debate, not understand the problem. Elena smiled. That's the irony of democracy. Everyone wants their voice heard, but no one wants to change their mind. They all went quiet again. In the silence, the glow of their screens felt oddly comforting, like a reminder that despite their differences, they were still connected, still trying to figure it out together. After a few minutes, Ava closed her laptop. She looked around her apartment. Books, papers, cold coffee. The debate had left her tired but thoughtful. She realized that what mattered wasn't who was right tonight, but that the discussion existed at all. Because in a world that moved too fast, where headlines screamed louder than the truth, honest conversations like this were becoming rare. Down the hall, someone's TV was still blaring with breaking news. A different anchor, a different panel, another round of opinions, but none of them sounded like the quiet honesty she'd just shared with her friends. She poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window. The city lights blinked below, steady and indifferent. Somewhere out there, people were still arguing about power, fairness, and who deserved to lead. But Ava felt something shift inside her, a small reminder that justice wasn't a headline or a courtroom decision. It was an ongoing effort, shaped by people who cared enough to question everything, even their own beliefs. As she turned off the lights, her phone buzzed one last time. A message from Elena read, "Tomorrow's lecture, the balance between principle and power. Want to join?" Ava smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." She knew the conversation wasn't over. It never really was, and maybe that was the point. That democracy lived not in the answers, but in the arguments we keep having. The ones that remind us we're still trying, still listening, still human. Morning came heavy with headlines. The resignation had turned from breaking news into a full-blown national storm. Television panels, podcasts, and online forums were filled with voices. Some angry, some grieving, some just tired of it all. Letitia James's official letter had been made public at dawn, and every word was being picked apart. It wasn't just a political moment anymore. It had become a mirror for the country's mood. Divided, emotional, uncertain. Ava sat in her office, staring at the window as rain slid down the glass. She had a meeting in an hour, but her mind wasn't on work. The Supreme Court's decision, the resignation, the noise, it all felt bigger than any one case. It wasn't about laws now. It was about trust. She thought of what Elena had said the night before. That democracy survives only if people still believe the system is fair. But what happens when they stop believing? She couldn't focus. She left her office and walked to a diner near the courthouse. The kind of place where time seemed slower, where conversations felt real. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. At the counter, an old radio played clips of politicians reacting to the resignation. Some called it a step toward integrity. Others said it was a blow to justice. Ava ordered a coffee and sat by the window. Around her, people were talking quietly. A pair of law students debating constitutional limits, a delivery driver shaking his head at the news, two retirees arguing about fairness. Everyone had an opinion, but no one seemed at peace. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You look like someone who's been thinking too hard." It was the woman sitting beside her, gray-haired, calm, holding a crossword puzzle. Her name tag said Mrs. Green. Ava smiled politely. "I guess I have been," she admitted. "It's hard not to with everything happening." Mrs. Green folded her paper. "It's always something, isn't it? Every decade, there's a new scandal, a new crisis. People shout, blame, demand answers. But underneath it all, it's the same question. Who do we trust to do the right thing?" Ava nodded. Trust feels fragile now. Everyone assumes someone's lying. That's because we've forgotten how to forgive, Mrs. Green said, stirring her tea. When leaders make mistakes, we want them punished. When they take risks, we want them perfect. You can't have both. Ava listened closely. The woman's tone wasn't cynical. It was steady, like someone who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Mrs. Green continued, When I was your age, we had Watergate. The country felt broken then too. But we learned something. People want justice, yes, but they also want hope. If every scandal ends with bitterness, we lose the ability to move forward. Ava looked down at her cup. So what do we do now? How do we trust again? Mrs. Green smiled softly. You start small. You trust your neighbor, your coworker, your friends. You build it back piece by piece. Laws don't rebuild trust. People do. The simplicity of that answer hit harder than any speech she'd heard all week. Ava thanked her, finished her coffee, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy with uncertainty. Across the street, a small crowd was forming near the courthouse. Reporters with microphones, protesters holding signs. One read, "Justice shouldn't be silenced." Another said, "No one is above the law." The two groups stood only a few feet apart, their chants clashing in the wind. Ava watched as police guided people to stay calm. There was no violence, no chaos, just noise, frustration, and deep belief on both sides. She spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Marcus. He was standing off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching quietly. She crossed the street and joined him. "Didn't think I'd see you here," she said. He shrugged. "Didn't think I'd come, but I wanted to see it for myself. Not the headlines, not the sound bites, just the people." They stood in silence for a moment, watching. A young woman nearby spoke to a reporter, her voice shaking but strong. "I came here because I believe in holding people accountable. That's not politics. That's principle." A few feet away, an older man spoke just as passionately. "Accountability, yes, but we also need fairness. If every decision becomes a witch hunt, no one will dare to lead anymore." Ava looked at Marcus. "It's strange," she said. "They're on opposite sides, but they're both right." He nodded. "Yeah, it's like we're all arguing different versions of the same truth." For a while, they just listened. There was anger, but also sincerity. The country wasn't divided between good and bad people, just people who cared about different parts of the same idea. When the speeches ended, the crowd began to thin. Reporters packed up their cameras, protesters folded their signs. Life moved on, as it always did. Marcus and Ava walked together toward the subway. "You ever think about quitting?" Marcus asked suddenly. Ava laughed lightly. "Every week," he smiled. "But you won't, right?" She shook her head. "No, I can't. There's still work to do. The system's not perfect, but if everyone gives up, it'll never get better." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, my dad used to say that too. You fix the system by showing up, not shouting at it." At the corner, they stopped. The traffic light glowed red, reflecting off wet pavement. Ava thought about all the people she'd seen that day. Angry, hopeful, confused, and realized that maybe this was what democracy really looked like. Not agreement, but endurance. Not peace, but persistence. Before they parted ways, Marcus said, I don't think her resignation is the end. It might just be the start of something better. Maybe this time we'll finally learn where the line should be, between justice and power." Ava smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe we'll just keep arguing forever." He laughed. That too. As they went their separate ways, Ava felt a strange calm settle over her. The shouting had stopped, but the questions remained. The kind that kept societies awake at night. The kind that forced people to think deeper about what fairness really means. That evening, as the sun set behind gray clouds, the courthouse steps stood empty again. The city moved forward, quieter now, but still restless. And somewhere between the fading headlines and the ordinary hum of life, the story began to shift, away from scandal and blame, toward reflection and rebuilding. Because behind every resignation, every ruling and every argument, there were people like Ava, Marcus, and Mrs. Green, ordinary citizens still trying to understand justice. Not as a weapon, but as a shared responsibility. And though they disagreed, they hadn't given up. They were still talking, still questioning, still hoping that one day, the system they believed in would live up to the promise that started it all. Weeks passed, and the chaos began to fade. The headlines that once screamed about Letitia James's resignation were slowly replaced by new stories. A market shift, a storm in the South, a celebrity scandal. The world had moved on, as it always does. But in quiet corners of the country, people were still talking. The Supreme Court's decision and the resignation had planted a seed, one that made citizens, teachers, and young professionals think a little harder about justice, fairness, and how fragile trust can be. Ava sat in a small college lecture hall, the same one where her friend Elena taught. She had decided to take the morning off work to attend a guest lecture titled Power, Principle, and the People. The audience was a mix of students, professors, and community members, all curious, all a little skeptical. Elena stood at the front of the room, calm and focused, her notes neatly stacked beside her. When a public official resigns after a court ruling, she began, most people see it as an ending, but sometimes it's a beginning, an opportunity to rebuild the public's faith in the system. Ava listened closely. She had heard Elena talk about justice many times, but today her tone was different. Not academic, not distant, but personal. Justice, Elena continued, isn't a fixed rule. It's a living idea. It grows when we question it and dies when we stop caring. The problem is we expect it to be simple. Guilty or innocent, right or wrong. But in real life it's never that clean. A student in the back raised his hand. So who decides what's fair? The law, the people, the media? Elena smiled. That's the hardest question. The law sets boundaries, but people give it meaning. When those meanings clash, when one person's fairness feels like another's injustice, that's when society is tested. The room went quiet. Even the students who had come for extra credit were paying attention now. Ava glanced around the hall. She saw young faces, thoughtful, frustrated, hopeful. It reminded her that every generation inherits the same challenge, to decide how much power leaders should have and how much trust they deserve. After the lecture, a small group gathered outside. Some students were debating the decision. One said it was a victory for balance. Another argued it punished moral courage. A third just shook her head and said, maybe both can be true. Ava smiled hearing that. It was exactly what she'd been thinking. That truth rarely sits on one side. Later that day, she met Marcus at a park overlooking the city. The air was cool, the trees almost bare. He brought coffee. She brought a quiet smile. They hadn't seen each other since the protests near the courthouse. Feels like it's been months, Marcus said. It's only been 3 weeks, she replied. But a lot's changed, he nodded, watching kids play on the swings nearby. I saw her statement again last night, he said, meaning Letitia James. It hit different this time. Maybe she really did it to keep the peace. Maybe, Ava said. Or maybe she knew the fight had gone as far as it could. Marcus sipped his coffee. You think the court did the right thing? Ava took a long pause before answering. I think they did something necessary. Not perfect, not heroic, just necessary. Sometimes the law has to reset the limits, even if it hurts good people. He nodded slowly. That's fair, but it still feels wrong that good intentions can cost someone their career. True, she said softly. But that's the cost of leadership. You stand for something and sooner or later, someone will stand against you. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of the park. Laughter, wind, a distant siren. The city felt calm again, but neither of them believed the calm would last forever. Another debate, another headline would come soon enough. Marcus looked at her. You know, before all this, I didn't think much about how laws are made. I just tried to follow them. Now I realize how much gray area there is, how much depends on interpretation. Ava smiled faintly. That's where the danger and the beauty are. The law gives us rules, but it's people who give them heart. When those two lose balance, everything cracks. As the sun dipped lower, Elena arrived, joining them after her lecture. She carried a folder of notes and a quiet confidence. You both look like you're solving the world, she said jokingly. We're trying, Marcus replied with a grin. No luck yet, Elena sat beside them. That's because the world doesn't want to be solved. It wants to be understood, Ava laughed. You sound like your students now. I should, Elena said. They're the ones asking the best questions. For a while, the three friends sat together, sharing stories and silence. No arguments this time, no frustration, just reflection. They realized that what had started as a political scandal had turned into something deeper. A national mirror showing how complex fairness really is. Elena finally said, maybe that's the lesson. Justice isn't a final destination. It's a constant process, sometimes painful, sometimes slow. But it only works if we stay part of it. Marcus nodded. So what now? Ava looked out at the skyline. Now we keep talking, keep caring, keep showing up. That's how change happens. Not in the courts, but in conversations like this. A quiet wind swept through the park, carrying away the last of the fallen leaves. The sky glowed orange and pink. a small reminder that endings and beginnings often look the same. That night, Ava walked home with a lighter heart. The world was still imperfect, the system still flawed, but she felt something different. Not anger, not confusion, but acceptance. She realized that real justice isn't about punishment or politics. It's about persistence. It's about people who refuse to stop believing in fairness, even when the system disappoints them. At home, she sat by the window, watching lights flicker across the city. Somewhere out there, debates were still happening. In cafes, in classrooms, around dinner tables. People arguing, questioning, learning. It wasn't chaos, it was growth. She thought about Mrs. Green's words from the diner. Laws don't rebuild trust, people do. And for the first time in weeks, Ava believed it. Maybe the Supreme Court had forced a resignation. Maybe it had drawn new lines. But it had also reminded the country of something important. That democracy isn't about perfection. It's about participation. It survives when people argue with respect, listen with patience, and stay engaged even when they disagree. Outside, the city kept moving. Buses roaring, lights blinking, people hurrying home. Life was back to normal, yet changed in quiet ways. Ava closed her eyes and smiled. The story wasn't over. It never would be. Because every time someone questioned what justice meant, the system got a little stronger. Every time people talked instead of shouted, democracy took another breath. And somewhere deep down, she knew, the next time the nation faced a storm like this, maybe, just maybe, it would be ready to handle it with a little more understanding, a little more grace, and a little more faith in the power of doing what's right, even when the answers aren't clear.